Judge Dredd debuted as a comic in the UK during the late 70s. Its portrayal of a trigger-happy Dirty Harry type with a giant eagle pauldron storming through a megacity drowning in filth and crime probably says a lot about British perceptions of the US at the time, but I can't really speak to that. I had never heard of Judge Dredd before 1995 when the Stallone film hit theaters, and it's a fine example of 1990s cinema aesthetics. Everything on screen pops. It's colorful, almost like a comic book in its saturation and framing. The sets are obviously sets. It's a fantastical setting. Every frame screams, "This is a movie, you're not supposed to believe it, just enjoy it." The action is over the top, the dialogue is corny. It's a fun action movie that conveys the idea of urban crime without really showing us anything too explicit or horrifying. 2012's Dredd reimagines the character, this time with Karl Urban in a much grittier, much more familiar decaying city setting that shares the visual style of contemporary films like Elysium or District 9, casting urban South Africa as the shape of things to come. A much darker, dirtier, and more brutal urban sprawl. The two Judge Dredd films are products of very different cultural spaces. A few things happened in the intervening years.
A huge explosion now raining debris on all of us.
This war will not be quick.
But even beyond the graphic violence and grimy cityscape of the later film, contrasting with the cartoonishness of its predecessor, the structure of the story speaks to that wider cultural shift. 95's Judge Dredd is a macro-level story. Deep secrets are uncovered, a corrupt regime is brought down, and it ends with the hope of better days ahead. It plays like a Hollywood movie. The villains are vanquished, and the hero rides off into the sunset. Dredd is more like a brutal episode of Cops. Mayhem and murder in a single megabuilding, one among hundreds, all of them with their own horrific crimes no doubt happening at the same time.
12 serious crimes reported every minute, 17,000 per day. We can respond to around 6%.
Which 6%?
Your show, rookie. You tell me.
There's no grand narrative, just bad people doing bad things, and at the end of the day, it's just another day. It'll be the same thing tomorrow. Dredd mirrors the jaded world that made it. At the time, it didn't make much of an impression on me, and I think that was why. It ended where it started. Watching it again, I have a greater appreciation for it. What I find most interesting about its story is that Dredd isn't the narrative focus. The main character is the rookie he's been assigned to evaluate, Judge Anderson. She's the one with the arc. Dredd himself is more an avatar of the law, of the system, personifying all its virtues and its flaws. He's a brutal man, but honest, which may be the best that that world can offer. The film sets the stage for what could have been a great ongoing series, with Dredd paired up with different partners showing the interactions of different personalities and value systems with his uncompromising idea of the law. Anderson, by contrast, starts off uncertain of herself, hesitant and out of her depth.
You ready?
Yes, sir.
You don't look ready.
But through the hardship of fighting their way through the megabuilding, she not only finds her strength, but she does so without losing her compassion. In the end, Anderson is a more noble representation of what the law should be. It's shown most clearly when she lets the captive tech head go.
He's a victim, not a perp, and until my assessment is formally over, I'm still entitled to dispense justice, and that's what I just did by letting him go. Maybe that'll be the one difference I do make.
She knows that he's there against his will, and while the law requires that he be sentenced for his participation in multiple felonies, Anderson believes that justice requires that the law be tempered by consideration of the circumstances. She embodies the idea that an imperfect system can still work for people if it's administered sensibly. The fairness comes not from the rules, but from how they are applied. Dredd, by contrast, is rigidly legalistic.
Judgment.
Vagrancy, 3 weeks ISO cubes, but prioritize murders?
Correct. Don't be here when we get back. Warned you. Get up. You're headed for the cubes.
The law is his religion, and he's a fundamentalist. In some ways, it's an admirable trait. He's incorruptible, which is more than can be said for some of the judges.
What's the price of a judge these days? $1 million.
But he's also prone to excessive brutality and has probably never considered extenuating circumstances when passing sentence. He's an absolute scourge to career criminals, but he's almost as dangerous to the general public because he'll punish any infraction, however minor, to the maximum extent of the law. The law. It's a complex and fickle thing that Dredd reveres. When written well, it's a statement of principles as well as a set of rules, clearly defined acts that are prohibited because they cause egregious harm, and the punishments that will be meted out for committing them. But law has also been the mechanism for the greatest atrocities in history. Slavery, gulags, industrial genocide, all made possible by the law and those who enforced it. Sometimes law is a solid foundation for social order and justice. But just as often, it's the shield of the coward and the sword of the wicked. How far does Dredd's reverence for the law go? Dredd captures the real dilemma with modern policing. Until a couple years ago, I lived in Western Oregon, worked just south of Portland. I knew a few people there who were on board with the whole defund the police thing, and I understand exactly where they're coming from. Of course, those individuals never lived in a crime-ridden inner-city slum full of drug traffickers and gang violence, which the back the blue pro-police side frequently brought up. Need help? Call a crackhead, they jeeringly say. But none of those folks were ever raided by a SWAT team in the middle of the night when a knock on the door would have been the sensible approach, or subjected to asset forfeiture during a traffic stop. For those who've never heard of it, it's when the cops decide your money might possibly have come from drug trafficking and they take it from you. Just straight up steal it. Dredd is a personification of the kind of law enforcement that you want protecting you when murder is imminent, but you don't want around otherwise because at any moment you can find yourself being hit with big penalties for very minor infractions. I view the film in that light, as an allegory for militarized police that you don't worry about much when they're pointed that way, but it casually turning a judging eye your way is a terrifying and very real possibility. Which brings me back to Anderson. She's probationary. See, she didn't pass the requirements to get her shield, but the brass wants her anyway because she can read minds. From a practical standpoint, great. It would be so much easier to catch criminals if you could just peer inside their skulls and find the bad guys. Except we all break the law. I often see the old line about the average American committing 3 felonies a day thrown around. It's an exaggeration, but there are so many vague laws on the books that anyone can be prosecuted if the authorities want to go after them. Lavrenti Beria's old "show me the man and I'll show you the crime."
Sir, he's thinking about making a move for you again.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want psychic cops walking around reading minds using that as evidence. It's absolutely ripe for abuse. And while Judge Anderson strikes me as a reasonable and compassionate person who wouldn't abuse that power today, who can say 5 or 10 years on after she's jaded from looking up civilization's anus day after day? The idea of someone like Dredd having access to instant psychic interrogations is terrifying. Half the city would probably be executed and the other half locked up for 20 years. And that's just with him being honest and dedicated without corruption or political factionalism coming into it, which would turn the Orwell factor up to 11. Dredd isn't just a great, gritty and violent action movie giving us a story that delivers without being overly complicated. Beyond the slow-motion gore, the gunplay, the brilliant costume design that takes the gaudy, absurd armor and makes it look practical, Dredd doesn't smack us in the face with its social commentary at every turn. It plants seeds to think about after, whether about the cycle of poverty, crime in prison, or more broadly, the core problem of trying to solve social issues with laws. We'll often talk about the government doing something or the law prohibiting something, but we have to remember that these things are just tools. The state is not a hand, it's a lever. The bigger we make the lever, the more power it gives the individual people who have their hands on it. And I'm not saying this as some anti-authoritarian that just doesn't like being told what to do. Back in the 20th, around the time that Stallone's Judge Dredd was out, I was going to be a cop, if you can believe that. Help people out, catch bad guys, seemed like a noble calling. But then it became clear to me that that wasn't the job. Giving tickets to people doing 5 over through speed traps or slow rolling through a 4-way stop at an empty intersection wasn't just a dick move, it was a core task. A big part of your evaluation. No, don't say quota, we don't have ticket quotas, but you do need to write more. I felt physically ill at the thought of shaking people down for the state. So I didn't do it. And because of that experience, I look at Dredd's portrayal of a mythologized super cop unerringly upholding the letter of the law, not only from the potentially receiving end of the stick, but also a brief look down it from the stick-swinging side. And I don't like it from any angle. Is Dredd a hero or a monster? That's the eternal question about any mechanism of social control. The pairing of Dredd and Anderson suggests that maybe the real trick of a good legal system isn't rigidity or stability, but the capacity to be applied to different circumstances, to take actions in context and administer justice even when the law demands otherwise. But if we rely on individual judgment and the hope that the people making them are always fair and rational, then we don't really have laws at all. We have a warrior priesthood whose judgment we mortals must simply accept. There's no easy answer here, and the lives of innocent people are destroyed either way. And maybe that's the deep truth of Dredd. It takes strength and conviction to fight evil, but at the end of the day, it's just another day. Tomorrow, the fight begins again. It takes Glock mags.